Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this podcast. My name is Dr. Irvin Scott, and I'd like to welcome you to Office Hours with Doc. Over the past 30 years, I, like many before me and many after, have devoted my life to America's children and its communities by working within the education ecosystem. In other words, I'm an educator. I've been a teacher. I've been a principal. I've been a district leader. I've been a nonprofit director. I've been a foundation executive. But so many before me have done those jobs, and so many people are doing those jobs, and so many people will do those jobs in the future. However, what we want to do in this podcast is look at individuals and listen to those individuals who are doing those jobs right now in order to do three things. One, we want to hear their stories, understand how they got to where they are, and what they're doing while they're there on behalf of America's children. And let's go beyond America, the world's children, because we have international perspectives that we'll be sharing. So that's the first thing. Number two, we want to better understand how these educators work within the ecosystem, not only as individual actors, because sometimes you have to do that, but more importantly, as team members to have impact. And then number three, speaking of impact, our goal is to hear how we might all work to accelerate our collective effort and impact going forward. These are the voices from the ecosystem that we'll hear in this podcast. If you've ever wondered what's going on in schools or school systems or school districts or however you think about schools in the U.S. and the world and the lives of those individuals who are shaping children's lives, if you've ever wondered that, this is the podcast for you. Office Hours with Doc. Welcome. Crystal, it is so great to see you. Welcome to this podcast, which I must say, Crystal, was the idea, the genius of your colleagues. And so therefore, I would say you're a part of why I'm doing this. I want to welcome everyone to my conversation with Crystal Brown-Garrant. You correct me if I'm wrong with that, Crystal. But I am so excited to have Crystal join me for this conversation. We call it Office Hours with Doc, Voices from the Education Ecosystem. We refer to it as a PK-12 education ecosystem, but it occurred to me that we will have individuals from even pre-K-16 higher ed at some point in time. And I'm just really excited to have Crystal join us. She joined me today. Crystal is the Chief Program Officer of Sandy Hook Promise. And already I am deeply interested in Crystal talking about her work. The name Sandy Hook should mean a lot to those of us who understand sort of the American context. And I'll let her say more about it. Sandy Hook Promise suggests perhaps that there's a foundation component or a nonprofit component, which makes me also very fascinated about having this conversation with her. And she's in a senior level position as the Chief Program Officer. She's a part of the Harvard Graduate School of Education Online Education Leadership Program, which is a program where students are honing their leadership skills, developing sort of a deeper understanding of what it means to lead throughout the pre-K-12 education ecosystem while simultaneously leading. So she's in a degree program while simultaneously doing the work. Okay, that's all I need to say. I'm just super, super thrilled to have Crystal join us today. I'm going to ask her a couple of questions, but let me start off by just giving her an opportunity to join us in this conversation. Talk a little bit about Crystal, who you are, the work you're doing, how you landed there, and then I'll jump in with some questions. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Dr. Scott, and I appreciate your leadership in expanding what we understand about K-12. So I am Crystal Brown-Garrant, Chief Program Officer at Sandy Hook Promise Foundation. I am also a mother of an 8-year-old daughter, and so very interested and eager and curious of thinking about how do you create safe spaces for kids while they learn. I also am a nonprofit professional. And I won't tell the entire story, but I left my home when I was about 16 and a half years old. And different parts of that ecosystem helped me to get into undergraduate and think about, what else do young people need besides teachers in the classroom? They need champions in all spaces. They need counselors. They need out of school time professionals to advocate on their behalf. And so kind of started my career during college, doing college access programming for high school students. Did that for a while in the out of school time youth development space, and then worked my way up and did a lot of interesting things. And the reason that I landed at Sandy Hook Promise Foundation was that in my national youth development context, we were really thinking about how do you create integrated safety strategies across a national network organization, everything from compliance to trauma-informed programming for young people. And I really thought that this idea of safety and well-being is its own discipline. It takes its own focus. And while youth development organizations need to have comprehensive safety strategies that range from programming to compliance and organizational effectiveness, I also think that there has to be dedicated thinking, resources, policies to drive the safety agenda nationally that then cascades to different organizations. So I have been with Sandy Hook Promise Foundation for about 2 years. I am honored to serve in that role. And Sandy Hook Promise was started after the tragedy at Sandy School Elementary School shooting in Connecticut. And it was a promise from our co-founders, Nicole Hockley and Mark Barden, to make sure that no other child experiences what those children experienced. And so birthed a program, so both a 501c3 organization and a 501c4 policy organization to start to build capacity for school districts to focus on safety and upstream violence prevention. So very honored to do that work. And I sit at a very interesting part of the ecosystem because I get to work with our policy team as well as lead programmatic initiatives for K-12 schools and, of course, out of school time organizations as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Crystal, for that real quick overview. You've said so much. Let me just start. Let me continue to sort of move in this direction of your personal connection to this organization. What was it about your background, your experience, or what drew you to land in this particular organization? And I'm sure you knew about what happened at Sandy Hook. I'm wondering if that was a part of the appeal, or was it your skill set? Talk a little bit about how you landed.
Yeah. From working with many young people, I got a glimpse of how safety shaped their lives and their decisions, whether they felt safe in school, whether they didn't feel safe, they had safe housing conditions. So safety has always been a lens that I've looked at in youth development programming. I also distinctly remember growing up on the south side of Chicago, and there were many times where my father was a minister, and so his church was on one corner and our house was on the other. And drive-by shootings were normalized in terms of you just exist in kind of this violent context. And so I remember one distinct time, my dad running down the street and he grabs me off my bike and we hide behind a bush. Right. So while I didn't experience a school shooting as a young person, I experienced what violence looked like and the barrier that violent conditions presents in terms of your life decisions and your circumstance. And so by looking at my own experience, and then seeing other young people who didn't have a sense of safety, I saw that that made the difference between them achieving and not. And so I believe that if you don't feel safe, you cannot learn. And that's it's a buzzword and a buzz phrase, but I really feel like in order to create safe conditions, it has to be programmatic, it has to be driven by policy, and it has to be driven by staff practices. Everything that happens every day that people do in a system to drive culture around what does it mean for people to feel safe in an organization or a school environment. So I could go on and on about that, but I do think that I get concerned by this, overlooking that, yeah, young people are fine, they're safe, and then we expect them to achieve academically. It is an unfair assumption put on our young people.
Yeah, that's so important. You mentioned policy, program, and practice. I want to come back to that at some point in time. But you also talked about, you went there beautifully, your own personal story. And I think we underestimate sometimes how the work that we do is connected to who we are. And not just who we currently, but if we look really closely, who we have been over time. So you go all the way back to a personal story with your father as a child, and now you land in a position where probably one of the most violent experiences that have happened for the most vulnerable children in our country, you're you're working on behalf of that work. I wonder if that ever occurred to you. You sort of alluded to it, but maybe just say something
Yeah,
a
I
little more
mean,
about
it
those
it it,
connections.
it definitely shapes my leadership perspective. One of the strategies that Sandy Hook Promise has is to diversify our partnerships and expand programming in diverse communities. And one of the things that I ask myself, I ask my team to consider is that we talk about recognizing the warning signs of violence, but those look differently in different contexts. And so, what does that mean for adapting program experiences or using inquiry based learning to help a young person arrive at what they're presenting, how it might be misinterpreted as a warning sign, and what that means for addressing violence. And so my leadership lens is very much driven by that experience of drive-by shooting, right? Like, while not a school shooting, there are still warning signs that present itself in each situation. And how do we consider culture and history and social context as we do this work beyond the compliance standard? There's so much more that we have to consider. So it's very much the lens that I look through as I do my work. And, it's difficult when you have a diverse workforce who only knows one angle of the conversation. And so constantly helping the team to reframe and say, when we talk about upstream violence prevention, or when a young person is at risk of harming themselves or others, what are all the factors that we have to consider and program against and provide training against to help educators, youth development professionals, and other leaders really understand how to have these conversations, and quite frankly, how to think about policy and programs and practices locally.
Mm, thank you so much. Nimble is the word that comes to my mind when I hear you talk. Um, the ability of leaders to be nimble, to take culture into consideration, to take region of the country into consideration. All of those things are tremendously important. The context in which these unsafe spaces happen. But in the end, they lead to the same results. Kids who don't feel safe don't learn. You said it beautifully. And so being an effective leader requires nimbleness, requires flexibility, and all of that, which I'm sure you're doing. Let's get to this policy, program, and practice. What does that actually mean in the context of the work that you do? Yeah, maybe some examples.
Absolutely. So let me start with which end do I want to start? I want to start at programs
Okay.
because I am a practitioner at heart. I worked as a part-time Boys and Girls Club professional to start my career. And so I always go back to when the rubber hits the road, what's the learning experience? And so in the context of programs, whether we're talking about traditional K-12 classroom or out of school time, we have programs that help young people practice, like, what does it mean to include others? We know that inclusion has been a factor as a warning sign in school shootings and other acts of violence. So we talk about inclusion and belonging. What does that look like? How do you facilitate those things? We talk about communication. How do you communicate when you're feeling unseen or unvalued? So, right, all of those skills, and I won't name what those skills are because that's a polarizing topic, but all of the skills that we want for young people to identify feelings, to communicate their feelings, to solve problems, to navigate conflict. Those are all the skill and the learning experiences that happen in programs, right? In that one-to-one teacher-student relationship, in a peer setting. So those are programs. And they have its place. But I always used to say that, the zest and the zeal of one person, whether that's a youth development professional or a teacher, is not going to transform the system, right? So you can do a program in one classroom or one out of school time setting, but it's not going to transform the ways that people behave and exist in a culture. But they do have its place, programs. When we think about staff practices, in our programs, we talk a lot about circle ups, turn and talks, all of these kind of facilitator practices that, yes, you can do in a program context, but they can be done across the school day. We've seen the videos of dynamic educators who have a different handshake and a different high five for every student so that they can be seen and heard based upon who they are in the world. Those are practices that extend across the day. So from the bus driver to the janitor to the front desk person to the teacher, those are practices that extend to create cultures of belonging and connectedness and inclusion, right? And there's so many other things, but those are practices that extend beyond a person and transform a system. And then you have policies, right? So how do we function together? What are codes of conduct that create definitions for expectations of behavior, for recognizing warning signs, for expectations for professional development of teachers, right? So all three of those things have their distinct place. There are different levels of leadership that drive those different dimensions. But my rallying cry as a leader and thinking about upstream violence prevention, you have to do the whole thing and not the parts and pieces. And what I've seen effective in school districts is when they are investing at all levels of leadership to really drive a comprehensive plan. I also understand that, teachers are burned out. There's concerns about teacher retention. And one beautiful thing about, if we look at policies, practices, and programs, we can connect the instructional goals of what teachers have to get done and how they do it to programs and practices that support upstream violence prevention. And so as we consult with schools, that's what we're trying to show them. If you do a circle up, you can do a circle up to drive math, right? You can do a circle up to drive literacy and engagement. So I'm really thinking about the multiple ways that you're able to get this work done in terms of effective violence prevention and also supporting the academic learning standards. It is important in a way that I lead. So that was a lot, but
No.
it's a place of passion and a leadership perspective that I carry every single day. I don't go one day without thinking about programs, policies, and practices and what that means for decision making.
Well, you said it's a lot. It's a lot, but you describe it in a very clear and comprehensive way. And it just makes me think of the word integrated. And the fact that if we are thinking of, although we may be operating in a specific area, right? But if we're thinking about it in an integrated way, or someone is thinking about it in an integrated way, it has the potential of producing the end result in this case, which is children who feel safe and who can thrive and who can learn. I wonder, I'm sort of take a real quick tangent here. So one way I hear you talking about programs, practices, and policies is from a career trajectory of an educator, right? And so an educator who starts off in more programmatic focus, let's say teacher, is really focused on practices. You gave some examples, facilitating, learning, circle up, or those are specific practices. They may not always see how the connection to policy. And but they know they're being shaped. Now, let's take it from the education, PK-12 education ecosystem. When I was in the classroom, there were policies that were affecting what I taught, how long I taught, the standards that I used. But I didn't always know necessarily how those policies were being made. I just know that they were impacting me. Um, let me, what's the question here, Irvin? I think the question is, um, do you see benefits in people who are doing the practice programmatic work having a better understanding of policy? Or would you say, I'm not sure? How would you talk about the knowledge gap that exists between those various levels? Hopefully, I've
I
framed
love
it.
this question. I love this question so much. I always believe that a practitioner, so I come from out of school youth development time, so I'm going to use that
Mhm.
experience. I always believe that a practitioner needs to see a peek behind the curtain. I think
Mm.
it is only fair because it gives rationale and why we're expecting them to do certain things in a
Mm.
certain, more compliant way. I also think there are boundaries for what that peek behind the curtain needs to look like, because it can be overbearing and overwhelming if they don't understand there are other considerations and factors for why those policies are in place. So I think there's a balance. I saw this beautifully in out of school time when we were exploring continuous quality improvement. And our goal was to really start to standardize the Boys and Girls Club experience. How do we standardize a Boys and Girls Club experience when you have such variation? And so we would look at data. What does our data tell us about how our young people are doing? We would observe our environment. Are the posters where they should be? If we're working with 6 and 7 year olds, do we need to literally physically move things on the wall for at eye level, different things. But in
Mhm.
those conversations, we also started to unpack what are some of the policies, right? What are the one-to-one student youth development ratio policies? Why are those policies important? We broke down policies around safety. And so you could see the youth development professional kind of curiosities around, okay, if we're looking at our data, we also have to understand what are some of our policies that are driving some of our current decisions, and then how do we make adjustments to have adequate program plans. It was such a beautiful knowledge sharing that I thought that like youth development professionals who were part-time were actually seen. They were
Mm.
brought to the table and they were given information that, pushed them to think outside of the boundaries of their influence, but it helped them to come along with
Mm.
some of the programmatic changes that were necessary to ensure a high quality youth experience. And so if you take that in any context, whether we're talking about upstream violence prevention or we're talking about, whatever the topic is, I do believe there's an opportunity when you're bringing stakeholders together in a school or out of school time organization to really look at the information and maybe call it information, right? Policies, sometimes that word is a barrier for people because they're like,
Mhm.
I can never understand what a policy is. A policy is just, definitions for how you engage and what are some of the constraints are, whatever. So bringing people together to understand that helps with the rationale about why we're implementing, why we're changing. And that's right. When you think about change management, the number one step is what define the change and then create awareness.
Mm.
And if you can't create awareness, people can't say, what does it mean for them in their role? And I believe that if people are able to understand just a little bit more beyond what they're called to do, one, you allow them to grow as a professional, and two,
Mhm.
you can bring them along to some pretty complicated transitions that are necessary to support the experience for kids. So I could go on and on.
This is rich. Yeah, no, this is rich because I hear a takeaway for two types of individuals and organizations: those who are doing the work on the ground, the practices within the programs, and those who are establishing the policies. And what I hear you saying to those who are doing work on the ground is every now and then peek behind the curtain. Try to get a better understanding of why they're asking you to do what you are doing. Obviously, your most important work is to do based on that policy, but there's value in trying to understand why. And not, you didn't say this, I'm saying this, not just complaining about it, but try to understand what's the rationale
And
behind it.
Dr. Scott, I wouldn't
Yeah.
be sitting here today talking with you if I had not, one, had my own curiosity to say, like,
Mhm.
what is that about? And two, for others in leadership to see me, right? That's also the responsibility. Like, see
Yeah.
me, hear me, and the types of questions. And by virtue of those two things, I've been able to sit at the table. And oftentimes I think about, like, man, I love being a practitioner. I love
Mhm.
working with young people. Like, I can be myself. I don't have to be stuffy. I don't have to wear a blazer, all the things, right? But I can sit at the table and I can understand and represent both the practice side of what happens in the classroom or in an out of school time environment for young people, what's good for them. And I also can balance it with the policies and the kind of political perspective of an organization. And as you advance in your leadership role and everything in between, those things become important to
So,
effectively lead and make the types of hard decisions that are necessary to the benefit of young people.
yeah. No, that's great. I think that is really, really important lesson for those who are close to the work, doing the work. And then the lesson you just alluded to it, the lesson to the leaders is creating space at the table for those who are doing it. There are a lot of leaders who, for whatever reason, they don't see the value in spending time explaining the reason why. They're like, this just because I said so. Terrible leadership. That's terrible.
Right.
I have learned over time when individuals who are doing the work understand why they have to do the work or what's the rationale, they are more inclined to do the work with more commitment, right?
Yes.
A better understanding, with more heart. And so you are illuminating just really powerful leadership principles, even as you talk, and I can understand why you're such an effective leader. Um,
Can I
okay,
say one thing?
go
Because
right ahead. Yeah.
your mind went. So, I have your beautiful PK-12 ecosystem graphic right here in front of me. I often look at it. And one of the reasons why it's important to get practitioners to be able to sit at the table is we often ask practitioners to be in conversations with funding partners, so investors and
Mhm.
foundations who support the work, particularly in the nonprofit context. And I have found practitioners who are so into the program, all they can do is describe the program, and that's great. But they need to be able to describe the strategies that support the
Mhm.
organization's work because that's what investors want to understand. If I invest in your strategy and I know that you've decided this strategy is important to move the organization forward, I need the practitioner to create the to bridge the gap between
Mhm.
the strategy and the program and the outcomes because that's what an investor is investing in and they have to be able to have that complicated conversation, bring their passion and their energy and what happens in that learning setting, but translate it in ways that others in the ecosystem can then support based upon their own goals that are, it's a different language, it's a different framework, and you have to be able to be that translator. So I just would be remiss if I didn't plug that
Mhm.
because I love that part of my job and it's hard and I get nervous every time I have to talk to a funding partner
Mhm.
but it's the ability to translate the work in the ways that they can understand.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that you have the ecosystem close by you. One of the reasons why I worked to create this framework was because oftentimes we operate within it, and as a result of not really seeing it or visually capturing it, we're less likely to be intentional. And what you just did was used it literally to explain the intentionality in this case of why it's important for practitioners to understand and be able to explain to funders. Funders play a huge role, we talked about this in class, an outsized role in what happens in an ecosystem. I think one of the ways that I have, having been at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I've always felt like funders, foundations have the ability to get the ecosystem to work a little more coherently if they incentivize the ecosystem to work that way. And it sounds like you're already thinking and seeing that power. Um, would you describe yourself as a funder? But you don't have to answer that question. You're going to say something, but then some people might be saying, "Didn't she say Sandy Hook Promise Foundation? Are they? What kind of foundation are they within the ecosystem?"
So that's a beautiful question. We are a do something foundation. So
Gotcha.
we have a 501c3 that functions as our programmatic arm. So we develop programs, we build evidence, we develop training, and we provide those services to school districts and other partners to support their violence prevention strategies. Sometimes people say it's school climate. Sometimes they refer to bullying prevention. So we provide and develop services free of charge. So we don't, no charge to schools or other organizations. We're a Do Something Foundation. But we raise funds to support that. So it gets a little bit complicated, but we try to underwrite all of the costs so that we're not charging for our services. So those are free services. And so all of the fundraising through grassroots funding, corporate sponsors, individual donors, federal grants, go to underwriting the cost of our programs.
Gotcha. So in some ways, and you might, well, you tell me, in some ways, I would also describe you as a technical assistance organization.
Absolutely.
Because you are helping systems, school districts create whatever you need them to create, these programs to ensure safety for students. That's what it comes back to.
Absolutely.
So you are technical assistance.
We are a technical assistance provider on our 501c3 side, and then on our Action Fund 501c4, we're a policy and advocacy organization. And those two things work together. We have staff that sit on both sides of that 501c3 and C4 distinction, which is, it's very interesting, Dr. Scott. I remember participating in one of our policy teams, leadership roundtables or something. And it was in that moment, I was like, what do I not know about who's in the room politically that I need to know to help scale my programs on the 501c3 side? So there's an intimate relationship, and definitely the work is distinct. I do want to say too, so while I don't make determinations about funding and giving away money, but I do make determinations about the types of partnerships that allow us to advance in the future. So looking at network types of partnerships and what level of investment we invest in that. Do I invest into research for certain partnerships over others? If I build evidence in one entity, how does that help us advance our organization and the partners organization? So I think about my work in terms of an investment, and maybe not financially, but related to program scale and reach. I definitely think about investments in that way.
Yeah, no, that's really good. In class, we've talked about resources in three ways: people, time, and money, and maybe even data. And so sometimes people think of resources only or investments only in terms of money, but there are other things that we're investing in the church: time, talent, and treasure. That's what we say in the church.
Yes.
And I know you got that church background, which you alluded to with your father.
Reverend Brown, sure do. Shout out to my dad. I wouldn't be who I am without Reverend Brown. So
I know that's right. I feel the same way. Crystal, you have been amazing in spending some time with us. You're doing amazing. You're leveraging the ecosystem. You can just hear it. You're leading with heart and soul, which is the title of the book that coming out with. I have to plug that, Crystal. Did you see that?
I have to. I ordered I did my pre-order last week, so I'm looking forward to April 9th.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to have you. Just leave our audience with sort of one takeaway around anything that you think would be inspiring, especially in light of, and I'm sort of directed in a certain way. I mean, the world has gone through a lot of trauma as a result of COVID. The U.S. has gone through sort of this historical trauma. Just situate us around why it's so important for work like yours to advance going forward? Just situate it that way.
So I always think about, when I'm 80, the type of care and concern and love that I want bestowed upon me by the younger generation.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a generation, they're hurting, they are confused, and they need spaces to, one, understand why they're hurting,
Mm-hmm.
like to really unpack what they're seeing. Why do I walk to school every day and I have to walk around chalk lines and detective teams just to get to school, right? That compounded experience of going to school in an unsafe condition, or being witness to domestic partner violence, maybe themselves personally,
Mm-hmm.
or in their home, right? And there's everything in between. And so if we want a generation of young people that are showing love and care and concern to their elders and one another, we have to think about the types of conditions we're creating to help them develop a sense of safety. And it doesn't mean anything if we say, oh, you're safe. No. It matters if they actually feel safe. We're talking about emotional safety, physical safety, psychological safety. And so that it pushes us to think about how we're designing learning experiences and other experiences for young people.
Mm-hmm.
Safety and well-being has to be the thing on the rubric, period. Because if not, we are further isolating young people who already feel isolated, and they're not going to be the generation that's able to bestow love and concern for themselves, for their peers and others. And I believe it's possible. One thing I'll leave you with, my daughter Jubilee, her teacher sent me a very cute note, and I was traveling and I missed it, and then I was on the plane and I read it. And she said, Jubilee has taken it upon herself that when she is finished with her homework, she helps BJ, no matter what. And BJ has an aide, but in the afternoon, the aide is not there. And Jubilee is savvy. She's really, really smart, but it's not just about her, right? She knows that it's not just about her making the grades and getting her work done. She sees her peers, and she literally moves her chair to BJ's desk. And she's like, BJ, we're gonna get this done, right? When we get it done, we get it done. And she sent me a picture, and Jubilee's giving BJ a high five. I want every young person in America to believe, one, that they can look beyond themselves and extend grace to another. That is a part of safety and well-being. That's how we drive safety. Those are the practices, right? That if everyone in a system does something similar based upon who they are and what their roles are, imagine the type of future we can shape. But if we don't do that and we lean on, the metal detectors and all the hardening things to solve this very complex safety conversation, we're missing the human side. We're missing the human side. So it is critical from a budget appropriation perspective, from a leadership perspective, all the way down to the classroom and the out of school time setting. This work is necessary. It is not soft work. And it's work that's possible, because I see it every day in my little person. And I am so grateful that her school has her as part of that community, because I know that she's going to bestow care, concern, and love for me and others when I'm 80. And I like that because I worked very hard. A little love.
Oh, that's beautiful. I think I'm closer to 80 than you are. And so I'll probably need it a little sooner. Crystal, what an amazing time I've been able to have with you. You are a joy to have in my class. You're a joy to have at Harvard. Just to hear you talk, I am sure you are a joy to your organization. And I'm inspired, and I look forward to the leadership that you do here and beyond. It is a type of leadership that we need across the US, across the world, as we build our future through our children. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank Thank you, Dr. Scott. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you.